Today I think we're going to talk about BIM and BIM as a definition, because of course BIM is a huge part of the construction process. It's a huge part of the conversation, and it's a major topic in a global sense, not just a local sense today. But I feel that the conversations that we're having, we need to clear up and discuss a little further what BIM in terms of its definition means for us as stakeholders within the construction industry. So today we're going to talk about BIM as a definition, BIM as a process, BIM and its stakeholders, and BIM and its technology, or the technology that surrounds or I guess helps in the delivery of the BIM.
Supports the process, right?
Yeah. So the first topic, Elia, first part of the topic, I guess, BIM as a definition.
That's an easy one.
Supposedly.
It's 3 letters in the acronym, and it calls for building information management.
I guess building information management and building information modeling, I think that second part confuses people a little bit when we talk about building information modeling. People believe that that's directly associated with the 3D model and the development of design, when in reality, the modeling aspect isn't actually
the 3D geometries.
So building information modeling and building information management, while they're the same thing, people are become a little confused with the modeling aspect.
It's about the modeling of the structure system for the information, not necessarily the modeling of the 3D geometries.
The digital asset or the one-to-one building in a 3D environment.
It's modeling the data that will feed into the project.
Yeah, and that data, again, is not just the building element data. It could be time data, it could be cost data, it could be sustainability data. These are the dimensions associated with BIM, right?
It doesn't need to be buildings, indeed. So it's building the information model, building the information and how it will be managed. But it also applies not only to the building industry, but also to the infrastructure industry and any other project that requires construction.
Absolutely.
The way we see it.
So building information modeling or building information management has predefined dimensions that are associated with the model, quote unquote, or the information. And I think it's important to define this. A lot of our listeners will already know this, but maybe some listeners are only directly connected with one of the dimensions and need to understand maybe the others. And we can start, I guess, at 2D, albeit the second dimension is kind of outdated now, I guess, to some respects.
Most important, and let's continue with definitions. The dimensions are meant to, or are defined to sectorize the content that will be developed inside each of them, but not necessarily as a sequence. So these dimensions are focusing on a portion of the information in the project. Let's say 2D is all the conceptual or details or descriptions, narratives. 3D is the volumes. 4D is the time associated, the time periods, not necessarily on execution, but also on design stages.
Full project, basically.
Full project information. Cost as the 5D. And then several common dimensions that is like...
They're becoming more relevant. I think now the 6th dimension being sustainability. Sustainability is a very big word in terms of what it includes.
We'll also have maintenance and operation
which is your
information as separate
7D,
dimensions, right?
So your 7th dimension being your facility management, which is the management of the built asset once it becomes operational. And we are now seeing that as part of the project's assessments and deliveries, we now need to look at whole life, which is inception to deconstruction or potentially renovation over a 30 to 100-year life cycle. So I think the definition of building information modeling or building information management now becomes a little clearer for us. It's defined by dimensions, albeit they follow a sequence in number. They do not follow a sequence in delivery or a sequence in planning. Exactly. Yeah.
Because while maintenance seems that it doesn't take place till the physical asset is actually delivered, actually the information aspect for the maintenance to be performed properly and actually to take as maximum potential or advantage of this information on the project, for that to happen, the maintenance requirements need to be defined very early. So the entire information of your model, of your project data structure is actually accounting for that.
And I guess that feeds in quite nicely into the second item, which is the process. So defining BIM, defining dimensions, we now understand that BIM is not just modeling in terms of 3D, it's actually many other aspects of data and information management. We also understand that it's not numerical and sequential like we believe it to be. Actually, the 7th dimension, facilities management, or the 6th dimension, sustainability, needs to be defined at inception of the project, before the project even begins. You can't follow the 3D or the 4D or the 5D. It needs to be defined early. So in that respect, building information modeling and building information management is really a process of information generation, collection, analysis, and sharing, perhaps. So then BIM is a process rather than a technology, or I guess a planning aspect or a deliverable on a project.
And in this process, you will have several stakeholders involved. So while we are representing the sequence of this process, and that's what has actually led to this misunderstanding or misconception by having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we have also siloed or created silos around these dimensions, understanding that only and exclusively the stakeholders involved in each of dimensions are responsible for the information they are producing. Now we need to try to merge that, like change that in the process. Like the architect is no longer only responsible for the information they produce for exclusively architectural purposes. Now we need to understand that they are producing information for others to use. It was the same before, really, but now at a higher level, right? Now it's not only the geometry we will be looking at, it's the information surrounding those geometries that will be used by others. And while that can be in the project elsewhere, it is about connecting it all. So we need to understand that these dimensions are not a sequence, but actually a parallel process where all the stakeholders should work together so that what they produce fits and it can be used by the other stakeholders in the other disciplines and vice versa.
So a couple of interesting comments and points there. I think BIM is a process. We need to define that process early in the project. We need to define how the stakeholders deliver information as part of the process. We need to define how that information is used and what it is used for. But more importantly, I would say that BIM is now forcing us as professionals and stakeholders to collaborate more, because obviously our listeners will know that we're quantity surveyors and cost managers. We manage the 5th dimension, albeit we are heavily reliant on the quality of information produced and delivered by the design team, the architect and engineer. So we now need to be able to sit in the conversation with our other discipline stakeholders to discuss with them what they're producing, how they're producing. And so in the old day, if we reflect back to how we used to design 2D drawings, you as another stakeholder could look at that information and decide for yourself what it's telling you as an individual. Whereas now we can't interpret information. It has to be exactly what it says.
let's be clear around that. This is nothing new. So that is a challenge that we had before and it's a challenge that we have now. The difference is that before we were reactive. You receive the information, you figure it out. Now what we are trying is to actually be proactive. The information is available. We have the technology available for us to actually have information in real time in a much fluid and a better operational. We have internet, we have telephone calls, we have many technologies around this that facilitate that communication and access to the information. So it is about being proactive and rather than actually reactive, trying to make assumptions later stage and actually increase the quality earlier stage rather than dealing with it and patching it later.
So then BIM as a process, we now need to redefine our process for project delivery because of this need for more integration during design development, during the project actually, not just during design development, during the entire project, because each stakeholder group needs to have an input into the development of that information. And this is in the conversations we have with the marketplace and other professionals, this is something really that people are struggling with. This idea of collaboration on a continuous, and when we mean on a continuous basis, we mean weekly, almost daily between stakeholder groups, architect and engineer. They're used to working together because they need to, the same way they worked together in the old days. But now the cost and time are coming into much, much earlier and are needing to be involved in the process much, much earlier. And again, on a continuous basis. So BIM as a process is something that we need to get our minds around.
It's the opportunity that we have at the moment to actually stop complaining about how bad quality the projects are, because there is no such a thing as a perfect project. But this is the opportunity we have to actually take action before it becomes an issue, before it becomes a problem, right? And we also need to understand that it's the responsibility of everybody, and it's not just limited to class detection or assessing that there is no classes between the geometries, but actually it's about there is no classes between the information, there is no contradictory information around, because BIM is the information of the project.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one. If we consider the clash detection, the value of creating a one-to-one digital asset or 3D model, the idea was clash detection initially, having that digital asset, making sure that we make decisions early in a design process rather than having those issues on site during the construction, where it becomes much more impactful and expensive to make those changes.
Which is just one of many of the benefits, right, of having this technology and this process in place.
Yeah. So if we talk about just clash detection, that's all well and good. But we could also look at quantities, the quantum of the geometry created by our fellow stakeholders, the design team, architects and engineers. That quantum aspects becomes hugely valuable to the project, hugely valuable to us as cost and quantity surveyors, cost managers and quantity surveyors. But because we have structured and set the project up to deliver that type of information, it means that many other stakeholders can use that information down along the project lifecycle, whether it's during design, whether it's procurement or construction, or even operation. So it's not just clash detection. It is now valuable information that we need to look at and understand how it's going to be used. And
all these different stakeholders will be using the information in different ways, right? And I think this is the reason why we have so many different technologies that have been developed exclusively to focus and master the usage of those informations for all these many different purposes. Yeah. And that, I believe, is another of the misconceptions we often hear in the industry that refers to BIM as the design software. Yeah. The software where you design, and therefore this software needs to accommodate all the other information of the project because it is your holy grail, right? Like the software doesn't exist such a thing in the process of BIM.
And of course it shouldn't either, because there's so many. If we just consider the design technology for a minute, and we'll jump back to stakeholders, but in just a minute. But if we just look at design, there are many different types of platforms and softwares available that will deliver the same quality of design output and information. So how, as an industry, can we focus on just one software or technology for all stakeholders? It's impossible. That's why IFC within an IFC is a data communication standardization that allows all stakeholders to communicate information with their technology or softwares. And that's really where the focus point needs to be in terms of quality and qualification. The quality of information you're receiving through your IFC data and how that's used by the other stakeholders.
Which is just the format of a file, right? The point of the format of this file is that you can actually open it from many other softwares without needing to actually purchase the specific license of the whoever has produced that information. It being an Excel file, which is also part of files or information that is feeding the project, or a drawing file, right?
And something about, you mentioned earlier on, about design information and the misconception that BIM is a 3D model, when in fact, if you look at the delivery of a design at each of the design gateways or at tender stage, actually the 3D model is only a small part of the design information. You have diagrams and 2D drawings. You have specifications relating to each of the disciplines.
You have contracts.
Project description papers. All of this is information associated with building information management or building information modeling. And it's very important to understand that. And also I would say that the 3D model aspect of the information is structured differently to the diagrams and is structured differently to the specifications. And there needs to be
and to the bill of quantities or to the time plan.
Exactly, because different stakeholders, and it's probably a good introduction for stakeholders now, different stakeholders look at information in a different way because they use it in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at and talk about the design disciplines, architect and engineer, within those two stakeholders, there is further multiple internal stakeholders. Facade architect is a specialization, landscaping architect is a specialization, interior finishes is a specialization, acoustic,
daylight.
You're in engineering, that's another multiple stakeholders within a stakeholder group, electrical, plumbing, cooling, ventilation,
data.
All of these internal stakeholder groups and disciplines create information actually in a different way, but all create information within the BIM environment, whether it is the 3D models, 2D diagrams, or the written specifications.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very important to understand for other stakeholder groups that use that information, especially the cost managers.
And not necessarily, like you are talking now, stakeholders that are producing like design information, but there is so many other stakeholders, as I've mentioned before. It can be not necessarily the ones that produce the information, but the ones that receive the information. They are also a key part of this process because they need to ensure that actually the information they receive is fulfilling all the requirements. We also have other stakeholders that will produce information for the project, for example, procurement. Yeah. They are also like sailing on the boat, and therefore they also need to follow certain conventions and certain agreements that are defined for the project, naming conventions for documents, how we format the date, all these pieces that are actually bringing quality for unifying the understanding of the information in the puzzle of the project.
And document naming and definitions is a very basic aspect to discuss. ISO 19650 has defined those requirements. And but again, it's all part of the data structure so that it can be used in the quality later.
And just creating a common ground of understanding what units are used in the project. That's all essential.
And these stakeholders we're talking about now, the professionals that create the information, the professionals that use the information, time, for example, in the schedulers and planners, cost in the cost managers, quantity surveyors, sustainability. All of these stakeholders are users of information in a moment in time within the project lifecycle. But the real beneficiary here is the client at the end of the day, because the client is the receiver of all of the information. They become the kind of gatekeeper of this information once the project is constructed and handed over for use. And it's the client who really needs to understand the power of quality data and quality process within the BIM delivery. And this, of course, like the rest of us, like all professionals in the industry, BIM has been a discussion point and a global development for a number of decades now. Different countries have different levels of knowledge and experience, but all of us as professionals are on the same journey. This is important to understand. Like the clients, sometimes you will have clients that are very well knowledgeable on the requirements of BIM, BIM as a process, the stakeholder groups involved, and other clients are not. And it's our responsibility as professionals to assist them in that journey.
They may even have very, very restrictive or very defined requirements because they already know what they want, because they already know for what are they going to use it, which is probably one of the first questions. Where are you going to use information? Therefore, what do you need to ask for? Some other clients may not have this so clear, but the earlier they define this, the better, because all the information that is being produced, it would be very, very difficult at later stages to try to make it homogeneous and actually take advantage of it for historical references.
Yeah. And you're almost trying to retrofit the digital information to suit what will be your future standards. Whereas starting early, and this is something that we're discussing with our clients at the moment actually, is you don't need to have a BIM 100% process from day one. What you need is to structure the information so that you can add to it in terms of its value and quality later if necessary. And that is not a BIM 100%, that could be a BIM 50%, for example, or whatever the case may be. I'm trying to define something that's undefinable. It depends on the project and the client, of course. But that's something that's important, that having good quality 3D, 4D, and 5D means that you can run a 60 and 70 sustainability and facilities management. But without the first three, you lose the advantage of applying the remaining dimensions to the project at a later date. And right now, I would say that all professional clients, whether they're asset owners or investors, should be delivering some form of a BIM process on their projects. And if they're not right now, then they need to consider it and be speaking to professionals that can help them with that. So the stakeholders, we mentioned the client, we mentioned the architect, the engineer, we have mentioned the scheduler, we have mentioned the cost manager. Sustainability is a key one. We have also discussed facilities management as a stakeholder.
And procurement.
Procurement as a stakeholder, yeah. The contractor, albeit...
What about the cost manager, Ross?
Yeah.
Are we forgetting that one?
Yeah. I think, the cost manager is an interesting one, and we're going to have an in-depth conversation on on this topic later, I think. But what you're hearing here is the disciplines. But of course, these disciplines sit within different organizations. You could have a scheduler in the client's organization, planning the entire project delivery for the client. You could have a scheduler looking at 4D in the contractor's organization, just looking at the building delivery. or at the subcontractor or supply chain, looking at their delivery. Again, when we talk about stakeholders, we are looking at disciplines, not necessarily companies, we would say. But these disciplines are in almost all companies, I would argue.
And it is actually much more imperative or much more important to define these common ground requirements, especially when you have multiple disciplines involved or multiple companies involved, sorry.
Yeah.
They all may have their own internal processes, but you as a client, you don't want to have a Frankenstein of a project. What you want to have is a homogeneous a project where everybody works together and fit into each other's process, and they actually contribute for a common project, not a project that is made from each of these companies to
standards.
End up with 17 different mini projects that combine into a big project.
Because at the end of the day, it's the client who is the asset owner. It's the client who will be running the building if they hold the asset, if they don't sell it. But even if they do sell it, they can also sell the information along with the asset. It will become a commodity in the future, this digital information, because investors will be looking to take over the operation of the building, and they will more than likely have facilities management outsourced, and the facilities management will require digital information. And it is, I guess, becoming more important that we speak more about the communication and the standardization across these stakeholders. So the last kind of point we wanted to discuss today then was BIM and its technology, not BIM as a technology, because as we mentioned, BIM is not a technology, it is a process. And all the stakeholders, again, will have their technologies, their softwares that they prefer. Like ourselves as cost management, there is multiple suppliers of cost estimating software, quantum or quantity extraction software.
There is a reason why each stakeholder has a preference for different softwares, and it's that these softwares have been developed and focused on fulfilling all the needs and making it easier for those disciplines to actually produce their information. And it makes total sense to use different softwares. Actually, if a project is delivered with a single software, I will just question how that was possible.
Yeah, and the qualities around it as well. Like, again, you can't estimate or prepare bills of quantities within a design software. It's you as a cost manager do not get the quality levels that you need, or even the information in the way that you need it, because as cost managers we follow cost breakdown structure, and that cost breakdown structure is extremely important to us because that's how we benchmark our projects. That's how we structure all the data we need from the different areas as we talked about before.
That's how the cash flows will be prepared for the client investment. That's how the payments will be organized and scheduled for later execution, right?
Yeah. And same with the scheduler. The scheduler will follow a work breakdown structure so that they can see what happens first, how long it takes. And that's not how a project is designed, because the designers follow a different structure. So the idea that we can deliver all of this in one software, we don't think is realistic.
Or even one single standard with following the same principle, right? There's no a standard that fills it all. There's not a software that fills it all.
So the technology, again, when companies are looking at building information management or building information modeling and considering what do we do or where do we begin, don't look at the software, look at the process. Look at how you deliver a project to date, how you would consider improving that process, and then look at what softwares are available that best suit your organization and the process that you've defined within your organization.
What type of documents you will be working with, right? You work with a single version of the project because you are only involved at a very specific stage. Will you be dealing with a lot of variations to that project? Therefore, your software needs to, accommodate for multiple updates and make that process easier for your team.
Exactly.
Just as an example of defining the requirement or the needs of the type of information you will be working with.
And I would say also that, and maybe you'll support me on this, I'm not sure yet, but I would also say that as a discipline, reflecting on the cost management, you don't need to know the design software. You don't need to know the detailing behind it. It's not necessary for you to know that. Maybe you need to, from a high level introductory, because most softwares follow the same process, you would need to know the design process as opposed to the technology. And you need to understand your technology and the information quality that comes again in IFC. We'll repeat that at IFC numerous times, I'm sure. The information and the quality of information coming out of the design technology or software, and how you use that within your technology.
Mm-hmm. And I think I agree, like you. The only point I would add is that because we are all embracing this new process, it is very useful to understand what other disciplines are maybe struggling with, or understand their process. Not that we necessarily need, but definitely having some brief experience, understanding what are the potential things that can be done on the other disciplines' side without disturbing too much their process. It helps to advise or to request changes to fulfill your own requirements without disrupting too much their processes. So definitely it helps, but I definitely it's not needed. And we should not be, as cost managers, we should not be using design software because do we design? If we need to alter the design for our own purposes, that version of the design we are altering is never going to be contractual, because then we will be assuming the responsibility of that design part, and that's not the point. So ideally, all these requirements need to be performed by the responsible of that information box, bucket, and then fed to us, meaning we don't need to use design softwares. We just need to understand what we need as stakeholders from the information others produce.
And I think that's a nice way to close off the topic, actually, is that BIM as a process requires integration and collaboration between stakeholders. It requires all of us to understand how other stakeholders work so that we can support other stakeholders and they can support us in the development of this information and the sharing of this information. And the result of that will be higher quality project, more clearly defined and more integrated.
Homogeneous, aligned.
Exactly.
One project.
Yeah. And by doing that, any other stakeholder that comes on after will be able to use the information because it will be clear. And I think that is definitely the value creation of BIM. Thanks very much for listening. There's a LinkedIn link below in the show notes. We would love to connect with you.
We hope you enjoyed it and have you with us in the next one. Thank you very much.